Earth is a unique planet, restless and dynamic. Continents shift and clash. Volcanoes erupt. Glaciers grow and recede. Titanic forces are constantly at work, leaving behind a trail of geological mysteries. One of the Earth's most intriguing mysteries is the presence of a huge arc of geological destruction surrounding the Pacific. It's known as the Ring of Fire. 3/4 of the Earth's volcanoes are situated here, and 90% of all earthquakes also occur along this line. Over the last 200 years, disasters here have claimed over 1 million lives.
Boxing Day, 2004. The world was shocked by one of the worst natural disasters of all time. Over 250,000 people died. The cause of this devastation was the most powerful kind of earthquake on the planet, called a megathrust.
And in Alaska in March 1964, North America's biggest ever recorded earthquake struck near Anchorage. This quake was so powerful that ground movements were observed 4,000 miles away in Florida. These terrifying events have driven scientists on to discover why such deadly quakes occur around the Ring of Fire.
In Alaska, we're looking at about 1,500 earthquakes every month. And you take all of those together and you start to see patterns. They map out a ribbon of earthquake activity that follows all along the coast.
This ribbon of earthquake activity extends all around the Ring of Fire. But it's what scientists can see below the surface that's most revealing.
You see that actually the earthquakes that are happening close to the ocean tend to be shallow, but as you go inland, they're deeper. And they create this dipping feature that starts out in the ocean and then dips down beneath the continent.
This giant dipping feature provides conclusive evidence of how megathrust earthquakes are generated. Subduction occurs when the sea floor moves and slides down under the land. As it descends, the top sedimentary layers are scraped off by the land like a snowplow scoops up snow. They're pushed up into a huge mound of mixed rocks. The Chugach Mountains were formed in this way. The seabed, loaded with water, continues down into the earth. This is how seawater travels deep underground, where it creates the magma plumes that build the Ring of Fire's explosive volcanoes.
It was a subduction zone off the coast of Sumatra that caused the Boxing Day earthquake. And worldwide, there are many other similar faults. The combination of massive earthquakes and tsunamis makes subduction zones a deadly geological hazard. This event made us realize how poorly prepared we are to face these huge geological catastrophes. And scientists are now trying to work out where else is at risk. They have discovered that a megathrust as large as the Sumatra quake could hit North America. A 600-mile-long fault lies right off the Pacific Northwest coast. The strange thing was, Cascadia didn't seem to be a danger at all. For years, scientists had been monitoring seismic activity along the Cascadia subduction zone. They found that, unlike other subduction zones, it was virtually silent. Brian Atwater wondered whether the native legends might be a warning that the Pacific Northwest could be at risk from giant earthquakes. So he took to his canoe and started exploring the marshes and rivers of the Washington coast.
We're on an ordinary coast, standing on a salt marsh like this one. Underneath, we find salt marsh deposits, salt marsh deposits, salt marsh deposits, just steadily on. But here, we have something completely different. We've got a spruce forest here, underneath the salt marsh. We can dig out here the bark of Sitka spruce.
These trees can only grow on dry land. Yet this layer of trees was covered with mud that must have been deposited by water. So the land here must once have been higher, and then, at some point, it dropped down, plunging the forest underwater.
At the time that the spruce forest dropped down, sand was laid down. It's the first thing that covers the peat is a little skin of sand. So that's the mystery. How did that happen?
Since there's no sand nearby, there must have been a sudden rush of seawater that carried the sand in with it. This was no gradual change in land level. It must have been a violent collapse.
The easiest explanation for that is that you had an earthquake that caused the land here to drop and also warped the seafloor. That warping of the seafloor set off a tsunami, and the tsunami then lays down the sand on the freshly down-dropped land surface.
Carbon dating of the buried trees showed that this event had occurred roughly 300 years ago, before Europeans had arrived. So the native legends might indeed be about a real event. Kenji Satake is a geologist who studies earthquakes and tsunamis. When Satake heard about Brian Atwater's theory, he realized Japan could hold the answer.
300 years ago is prehistoric time for Americans. But in Japan, we have documents that would record the tsunami from Cascadia 300 years ago. So that's why we started looking for the records.
So Satake started hunting for records of an orphan tsunami that could have come from the Pacific Northwest. And in the coastal town of Miho, southwest of Tokyo, there's a document that describes just such a tsunami.
On this page describes the tsunami of January 28th, 1700. On that day, from morning, the tsunami arrived this town, like a high tide, and the receding wave was like a big river, and it continued like 7 times until the noon of the day.
The account told how the villagers took refuge in a shrine that still exists today. The author also recorded that this tsunami was unlike any that he had experienced before.
Writer noted that there was no earthquake, but the tsunami arrived, so he was surprised. and he said such a strange thing should be passed to the future generation.
Crucially, the same tsunami was recorded in 4 other accounts from different parts of Japan. So this couldn't be a local event. Satake thought this tsunami might indeed have come from a huge megathrust earthquake 5,000 miles away in Cascadia. 100 miles southwest of Seattle, in a remote area of the Washington coast, is the Ghost Forest. These are trees that died hundreds of years ago, but remain standing to this day.
Sometime in the past, this would have been an intact red cedar forest. Large trees standing 100 feet or more in the air. And this landscape was filled with them. And then one day, something killed the trees here in place. And the mystery is, what killed them? You know, what could kill an entire forest along 60 miles of Washington coast, just like this?
Tree specialist David Yamaguchi has spent years trying to solve the mystery of what happened to the trees. He wanted to work out when they had died by looking at their tree rings.
Most people know that trees have annual rings. So depending on the climate from year to year, the tree rings are either wide or narrow, or wide or narrow. And so they're developing a barcode going back in time that's unique in time.
Using this pattern, David was able to work out exactly when the trees had died. And he found out that all of them had died around the early months of 1700.
The summer before the tsunami hit Japan, these trees were just growing happily in the forest here. Then the winter came along, and by the following summer, they were all dead. And so the tree ring story matched the Japanese tsunami records perfectly.
There was now no doubt that the same catastrophe that had killed the Ghost Forest had also sent the tsunami across to Japan. And from the Japanese records, Kenji Satake could work out exactly when it had happened. On the 26th of January, 1700, at 9 p.m. And there was a simple explanation for why Cascadia wasn't creating earthquakes. If the plates were moving smoothly past each other, there would be no strain being built up, and no earthquakes. The scientists knew that if it had happened here once, it would happen again. One day, the people of the Pacific Northwest will face a megathrust earthquake. So how big will it be? What damage will it cause? And when will it happen?
About 2,500 years of earthquake history. 1, 2, 3, 4 events recorded. Radiocarbon ages show that this event happened about 600 years BC. And that this event happened about AD 400. So something about 1,000 years between this event and this event, a very, very long time. This event's from about AD 700. There are only about 3 centuries between this event and this event. This is about the same amount of time as between here and today. So this is why it would not be surprising if, while we're standing here, another one of these great Cascadia earthquakes happened and we have to run to high ground.
And that is the problem. The next megathrust earthquake may not happen for centuries. Or it could be imminent. No one knows.
Now, we do not know exactly when the next Cascadia earthquake is going to occur, but we do know that the impact of that earthquake in terms of the ground shaking, the huge area impacted, the extent of land level changes, the size of the tsunami which will be generated will be very comparable to that which was seen on December the 26th in 2004.
North of Cape Mendocino, along the coast of Northern California, Oregon, and Washington, however, the land has been slowly rising such that many of the tide gauges actually show a small drop in sea level over the last century or so. This region lies along the Cascadia subduction zone, where the Juan de Fuca plate descends or is subducted beneath the North American plate. This builds up seismic strain along the coast, which actually pushes the land upward and explains why sea level in the region has dropped even as global sea level has risen. This could all change very rapidly, however, if we have a large offshore earthquake, which could cause rapid subsidence and therefore an instant rise in sea level.
In the case of a megathrust earthquake, the overlying plate, which has been bent, pings back upwards into position. And it's that sort of pinging motion that transmits an enormous amount of energy to the seabed. That energy is then transmitted to the water above it, which oscillates up and down and then moves out as a series of huge ripples. And that essentially is what a tsunami is.
A tsunami is very different from a normal wave. In normal waves, only the water on the surface is moving. But a tsunami involves the movement of the whole water column. Millions of tons of water.
2 years ago, a major earthquake hit Japan, devastating towns and triggering a tsunami. That hit us here on the West Coast.
Now, new research shows we may be next in line for the big one, sooner than geologists originally thought. News 10's Whitney Clark has details.
It feels like we're always talking about the big one.
This is something I thought impossible.
Turns out new studies show big earthquakes like this happen in our area more often than we had thought. Geologists say what happened 2 years ago in Japan will happen here basically any day within the next 50 years. Geologists say the last time there was a big earthquake here was 312 years ago. Taking a look at a timeline, scientists say the average time between big events about 240 years. Now, the state wants people to know what to expect.
In 2011, Oregon legislators ordered a study to see how the, quote, monster earthquake and tsunami would impact our coast. The research indicates 10,000 people would die and damages could exceed $30 billion.
For the last 7 or 8 years, we've been getting more and more information from our Department of Minerals and Geography that we are really at the precipice here in time.
So this is a model of what the Cascadia subduction zone, the next earthquake, might look like, and the possibility we may be able to provide some early warning of strong ground motion before it reaches the urban areas. And in this scenario, we're looking at probably the rupture will come as close as 150, 200 kilometers from Seattle, a bit closer to Portland. And the Cascadia subduction zone stretches all the way from Cape Mendocino, California, up into British Columbia. So it's a very long rupture. So there could be as long as 5, perhaps even 6 minutes of ground shaking, or the rupture will take that long to progress all the way. If the origin occurred now, then within a minute, we could detect that, know it's a big earthquake, know it's on the subduction zone, and generate a warning, say to close the Alaska Way Viaduct, or any number of things may happen. That's not our end of it, but we're hoping to, in the not too distant future, be able to give this kind of early warning of an earthquake occurring.
So just walk me through, like right now you're seeing this, and this, what would happen in real time here? What would this?
Well, this is an attempt to be at real time. This circle is the P wave, or primary wave, which is like sound traveling through the ground. The red circle is the shear waves generated by the earthquake, and that's what really gets us rocking back and forth. So at this point of the earthquake, only part of it has progressed. We could be issuing a warning when the P waves haven't even reached Portland yet. So the shaking won't get intense in the Seattle area for another 2 minutes or so. So we're going to be able to give warning. Now, of this 5 to 6 minutes of rupture, the strong ground motion in Seattle would probably be limited to about 2.5 minutes of really strong ground motion, although we could perceive it much longer.
And again, this is an idea that could happen now, that you could have a 3 or 4 minute warning?
Well, we're not set up at this point yet to alarm on this. So it's something that technologically is feasible. We have the network to do it, but there needs to be a bit more software development and testing before we have an operational warning system.
And this is an assumption that this particular quake would occur obviously a couple hundred miles south.
Right, and that's the ideal. But even if it began off of Nia Bay, there still could be time to provide, 30 seconds warning. We still have an opportunity to provide early warning when this system is developed, but this is a best case scenario if it starts in the south.
Scientists believe the next Cascadia earthquake will be one of the largest on the planet, up to magnitude 9. Just as happened in the Indian Ocean, this huge earthquake will cause a sudden uplift of the sea floor, and that will create a tsunami. So even though there are no major cities on the coast, there will still be many thousands of people at risk from the tsunami. But far more people will be affected by the earthquake itself. What follows is a reconstruction based on the knowledge of leading experts of what may happen, what it would look and feel like to experience a megathrust earthquake. The rupture is most likely to start at one end of the fault. It would then spread along the fault at over 7,000 miles per hour. In just a few seconds, the earthquake would reach the land. The earthquake would be at its most violent here on the coast, but the shaking wouldn't have reached the inland cities yet. People here wouldn't even know that an earthquake had started. However, news would have reached the emergency services. But there would be no time to issue a public warning before the earthquake hits the big cities.
The first thing you sense is a vertical acceleration. You get pushed up a little bit, and you think it's maybe a jolt of a train going by or something of that type.
But then later, maybe 20 seconds even later, you might start to feel the shear waves coming in, which are shearing motions in the earth, the kind of motion that does most of the damage.
These shear waves would move the earth from side to side by as much as a meter. There would also be surface waves, like ocean waves rippling through the solid earth. As the shaking becomes more and more intense, people would realize that this was no ordinary earthquake. Buildings would now be exposed to huge forces as they're shunted back and forth. The unreinforced masonry buildings would be the first to suffer damage. Indoors, objects and furniture would be hurled around the room. Parts of the building may start to fall. For people outside, the major hazard would be falling debris and shattering glass. Collapsing URMs could cause many fatalities throughout the region. The shaking in Seattle would now have been going on for 2 minutes, but we'd only be halfway through. Meanwhile, the large movements of the ground would be making skyscrapers bend further and further. The worst-case scenario would be the total collapse of a high-rise building.
It happens so fast that it lifts up the whole body of the water on top of it. And as a result, suddenly the sea surface finds itself 2 or 3 meters higher than it was before, over a large area, and that sets off a wave.
It would take many hours to reach the other Pacific nations. It would take 5 hours to reach Hawaii, and more than 10 hours to reach Japan. Thanks to the sophisticated Pacific Tsunami Network, those countries would get a warning. But the situation in the Pacific Northwest would be very different. The tsunami would arrive there in half an hour.
There won't be time for the Tsunami Warning Center to detect that earthquake, make a determination whether or not it was tsunamigenic, then send a warning down to emergency managers in Washington, who will then send it to the people.
That first wave is often simply a step in the water level, and the water level then stays up high for 5 or 10 minutes before it eventually drains away again.
People need to know that when they feel strong shaking, if they're on the coast, they need to go to high ground and or inland.
Just as happened in Indonesia, within half an hour of the earthquake, the tsunami would rush onto the land, more like an ever-growing tide than a normal wave. Anyone who doesn't manage to get inland or to high ground in time would be unlikely to survive.
We expect a tsunami on the coast within the next 100 years.
In an interview last year, Senator Alan Bates explained that these warnings were behind the creation of Measure 77, which amends the Constitution so Oregon's governor can declare a, quote, catastrophic disaster. One that could look a lot like this. The Japan quake and tsunami was a 9 as well. And for 30 days, the governor could allocate money however he or she deemed worthy.
This is survivable.
The state says under current conditions, the damage in Oregon would be catastrophic. Electricity would be off in valley areas for up to 3 months, up to 6 months for the coast. Drinking water and sewage services not working in the valley from a month to a year, while on the coast they could be off for up to 3 years. Roads and bridges destroyed. State emergency workers taking that message on the road, traveling to coastal communities for tsunami roadshows this month, hoping to prepare and educate up to 1,500 people, including Brookings, where geologists say there is a 37% chance of a major earthquake in the next 50 years. A major earthquake means something between an 8.0 to 9.0 along the Cascadia subduction zone.
If you're outside somewhere, the best thing to do is to move quickly into open space, such as away from a building where you might have falling objects.
Schools and offices now practice this life-saving maneuver, going under a strong desk and holding onto it.
Quickly, all of you.
The simple knowledge that after an earthquake, people should move away from the ocean and to high ground can save lives. The scientists who discovered this threat are now playing their part in spreading the word to as many people as possible.
Goes all the way up to a salt marsh.
Earthquakes this large can generate landslides at distances up to hundreds of miles away.
A dramatic upheaval in the earth today on a small island off the coast of Washington state. Residents say it began with a mysterious sound, almost like thunder, and then something terrifying. The earth seemed to crack open. ABC's Neil Karlinski is there.
One home was swept away and nearly 3 dozen are now evacuated, but remarkably, no one was hurt. This is what it looked like before and now. People below had to be taken out by boat, some with just a handful of their possessions.
It's how you live after the earthquake and how able you are to help others.
With all the warnings, the question is, are people preparing?
Not yet, but I want to stock up on water and get stuff that we need, you know what I mean, in case something like that happens.
Unfortunately, I haven't done anything to prepare for it.
So despite public apathy, Dittmer is taking the data seriously, showing me his home survival kit.
Unfortunately, I don't think people understand that a Cascadia earthquake is going to be so very different than the other types of earthquakes that we've all experienced, or many of us have experienced. One of the main differences is that it's going to affect such a large region.
It's not just going to be city of Seattle or city of Portland. It could be an 800-mile stretch of Washington, Oregon, and California that gets affected.
The Indonesian earthquake has given the people of the Pacific Northwest a glimpse of what they will one day face. Now they must heed that warning.